Recently, there's been a lot of conversation and controversy regarding the United States and its flexing of its military, economic, and political muscle around the world, and specifically within the Western Hemisphere. Now, this comes as the United States launched a strategic and surgical operation to remove the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and also has been followed by repeated threats made against the regime in Cuba. Now, whether or not you agree with what has been going on, or whether or not this is indeed the right course of action for the United States, those can be answered separately and indeed can be the topic of entire episodes in their own right. And a lot of talk of United States imperialism and expansionism and Manifest Destiny Part 2 has also arisen in recent weeks. Yet, this is not the first time the United States has sought possessions and territories abroad. And it's certainly not the first time in history that this has occurred, specifically in North America. Indeed, the United States often has a checkered past when it comes to imperialism or colonialism or whatever it is that you'd want to describe the term that began this concept of American exceptionalism. Because while the United States was not as ruthless as the Belgians in the Congo, the British in Kenya, or the French in Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, it still does not take away from the fact that the United States, at one time or another, had in its possession nations which today are sovereign in their own right and subjected those people to its policies that originated and stemmed from Washington. Even today, the legacy of U.S. imperialism lives on. Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. territory of Guam in the Pacific are all examples where the United States has, in its history, gone abroad, acquired territories for one reason or the other, and has incorporated it into the much larger United States empire. And that's not to say this was good, bad, or indifferent. That is just the history. And one of those, arguably you could say the first major colony, certainly the first colony that was earned following a period of prolonged bloodletting and open conflict, was the archipelago of the Philippines. And the Philippines has had an interesting history. Prior to the United States, they were a subject of the Spanish Empire. Ferdinand Magellan was actually the first Spanish citizen, explorer, conquistador to arrive in the Philippines, and he was actually killed there as a result. And it would take another 40, almost 45 years before Spain declared it part of its empire. And when you look at it on a map, even today, one wonders what strategic value did the Philippines hold for the Spanish? Spanish were at that time an empire that was predominantly faced with the need to expropriate and exploit the colonies in which it had in its possession, and it certainly did with great efficiency in Latin America. And it was also focused on expanding in the Atlantic, on the west coast of Africa, North Africa, and across the Atlantic. So for it to have had aspirations to control such a large landmass in the Pacific, it begs the question, why was it such a high priority that Spain would send arguably one of the greatest explorers, navigators in world history to go search for it and attempt to establish it as a Spanish colony, which, though it was not successfully done by Magellan, eventually occurred by an individual by the name of Miguel Lopez de Legazpi. And as you can imagine, this episode is going to be particularly difficult for me to correctly pronounce names, whether it's nations, people, ideas, battles. So please be wary of that fact. Nevertheless, the Philippines eventually became a staging area for Spanish trade in the Pacific, specifically relating to spices, which was a hot commodity in the 15 and 1600s. And Manila, today the capital of the Philippines, became a major trading hub. And with that trade came Catholicism. At the time, Spain was ruled by a monarchy that was interlinked with the Catholic faith. And today, Spain is a predominantly Catholic country. So as a result, when trade occurred between Spain and Europe, the Philippines and Asia, it brought with it friars and missionaries who did their utmost to convert the native population, the Filipinos, into Catholics. And actually, they were more successful than one would think, given the spotty track record of forced conversion of religious or cultural beliefs throughout history. And even today, the legacy of Catholicism in the Philippines is still present, as it is one of the dominant major religions in the nation. Yet, much like how the Spanish colonies in Central and South America rose up in revolt and ultimately won their independence, the Philippines themselves also had yearnings for freedom, for liberty, and to rid themselves of the shackles of Spanish oppression. And there were many revolts that centered around this idea of Filipino nationalism, a nation state that the Filipinos themselves could consider their own, that wasn't ruled 1,000 miles away, but was in fact ruled locally by the Filipino people themselves. And those revolts really started to pick up in the 19th century. Individuals such as Jose Rizal and Emilio Aguinaldo took center stage in spearheading the rise of Filipino independence. And they ultimately played a role in the eventual collapse of Spanish control in the Philippines. Obviously, the United States' intervention, particularly at the Battle of Manila, where Commodore George Dewey's Asiatic Squadron was able to sail right into Manila Harbor, surprise the Spanish ships, which were still anchored, and destroyed all of Spain's warships, or at least crippled them to the point where they could no longer serve the useful purpose for which they were built. And this was done while suffering only one casualty, that casualty being from heat stroke. So immediately after the United States is able to destroy the Spanish fleet in Manila Harbor, and once the Spanish-American War concludes, the United States is able to acquire from Spain Cuba, which it places a virtual mandate on, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, among other smaller territories. And Aguinaldo believes that now that Spain is no longer our imperial master, and the United States, which at one point fought a revolution for its independence, would look kindly upon us seeking out our own independent nation. And indeed, it was a noble concept. However, the United States has no such intentions. And when the First Philippine Republic is established in 1899, the U.S. does not recognize it. As a result, Aguinaldo decides to once again reignite the passion of Filipino nationalism, take to the jungles and revolt against their new occupiers. And this would result in a brutal and deadly guerrilla war, and one that would see many casualties occur, not only among the combatants themselves, but among the civilian population. And indeed, one could argue that the civilian population suffered the most out of any side in the Philippine-American War, or Philippine-American insurgency, depending upon how one looks at it. And this is where the focus of the episode will come into be. And this is where the relevancy of the three books examined will also come into being. While this was happening, the Philippine-American War, U.S. occupation of the archipelago, two prominent individuals whose offspring would play an even more prominent role in history were figured into this historical wrestling match between empire and struggle for independence. The first individual was a man named Robert Wainwright, who was an officer in the United States Army, the cavalry no less, who was stationed in the Philippines during this time period. He had fought in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba during the Spanish-American War and was in the Philippines at the turn of the century. He would birth a son named Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright IV. And only less than 20 years after he was born, his dad, Robert, died. So as a result, Wainwright had an obligation, a duty, to fulfill the legacy of his family by continuing to serve in the armed forces and to serve so with honor, distinction, and courage. And of course, that's what he did, joining the Army in World War I and serving in that conflict. He also was attached to the cavalry patrolling the U.S.-Mexico border when there were skirmishes involving Pancho Villa and other Mexican bandits. And he, in his earlier days, or maybe even one of his earliest assignments, was stationed in the Philippines. And he saw combat fighting against the Moro rebels, which were a group of mystic Muslim fighters who never really accepted the concept of U.S. domination following the end of the Philippine-American War, which some say occurred in 1902, some 1903, some even into the 1920s. But for all intents and purposes, major combat had ceased by 1905. The second individual who figures prominently into this story was Arthur MacArthur. He was a Medal of Honor recipient from the Civil War and was the U.S. military commander in the Philippines, sort of the generalissimo of all American ground forces. And he was tasked with rooting out and destroying the rebellion. And his methods were quite successful on the whole, given the fact the United States had been engaged in a similar style conflict against the Native Americans on the continental United States. So, using those tactics and applying those strategies that he had learned, as well as the soldiers who fought with, under, and among him, MacArthur was able to spearhead the campaign to successfully suppress the Philippine insurrection. Now, granted, he was not entirely successful. He had disagreements with the Governor General, a man by the name of William Howard Taft. And though he was a civilian, he still technically outranked MacArthur. And as a result, the two did not see eye to eye. One thing led to the other, and MacArthur was relieved. And because he was relieved, it was viewed as a disgrace to the MacArthur name. Not he himself, but the fact that he was removed after doing such a phenomenal job, and the myth of never really trusting politicians or never really coming to agreement with individuals who were not in the military class of that day began to take root. And indeed, it would last with MacArthur for the rest of his life. He would have a continued and even militantly negative, dim view of politicians and civilian leaders as a whole. And Arthur MacArthur had a son, and that son was named Douglas. And Douglas MacArthur would go on to, well, become one of the most successful and controversial Americans in world history. Certainly American military figures, but also Americans in general. He graduated first in his class at West Point. He was the youngest brigadier general in all of World War II, and there were many credible reports saying that he ought to have won the Medal of Honor for his valor and heroism under fire. He served as the superintendent of West Point and the chief of staff of the U.S. Army. And by the early 1940s, he had taken the role of field marshal to the Philippines, Philippine Island. So it's interesting how he had so many different roles and he had such a long resume of positions and titles and experience. And not only that, but with it came his enormous ego, one that was constantly puffed up by his mother, and one that he himself actively fed into and believed as much as he could at any turn, and even utilized outlets such as the press and his own personal chicanery and machinations to further inflate it. During World War I, he wore an unorthodox uniform that was not up to the regulation standard of the day, which of course he didn't care about. As Army Chief of Staff, he controversially ordered the disruption or the breaking up of the bonus marchers. The bonus marchers, of course, were the group of World War I veterans who were camped outside of the Capitol building in Washington, demanding that their pensions and or other commitments made to them while they were fighting in Europe be satisfied, those obligations that the U.S. owed to them be fulfilled. That was not the case. He broke up them in a manner that was very reminiscent of how the National Guard would be used as muscle for big business during the Gilded Age, and that certainly got him a negative rebuke from those who were present. And then while he was the U.S. military advisor to the Philippines and the Field Marshal of the Philippine Army, he was very dramatic and egocentric and narcissistic. Dwight Eisenhower, who was a colonel at that time serving on his staff, said that he had learned while being with MacArthur 5 or 7 years of theatrics because of how MacArthur would just act, how his manner and style of leadership would be, and how he would sometimes refer to himself in the third person. Very interesting character, to say the least, but he was also the man who found himself in the right moment at the right time, and he was the right person to ultimately satisfy his self-interests and his end goals. Indeed, nobody could do it better than Douglas MacArthur. And by 1941, December 1941, he would rise to meet the moment in which he found himself. Again, extremely controversially. So, to provide some context, December 7th, 1941, the United States is attacked by the Japanese, who launch a daring and surprise assault on the U.S. military installation at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. They also strike U.S., British, and Dutch possessions on the Malay Peninsula, modern-day Malaysia, Guam and Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies, today Indonesia. And on December 8th, 1941, on the other side of the international date line, the Japanese begin their attack against the Philippines. And through one reason or the other, the U.S. does not adequately put up a strong enough defense to combat the Japanese in any serious manner. They put up resistance, but it's half-hearted, and largely because of the failure on the part of MacArthur to adequately and effectively utilize the military equipment that he has at his disposal. Now, to be fair, a lot of those airplanes, P-40 Warhawks, the Brewster Buffaloes, B-17s are the exception, but generally speaking, they could not even come to within 1/10 of competing against the Japanese Zeros, Kates, Vals, and all their other sophisticated equipment. Now, it's interesting to note that the Japanese have often been considered as being unsophisticated when it comes to technology in World War II, and by and large, that is accurate. But in those first early crucial months of the war, and even the first full year of the war, their equipment was, if not better than the Allies, certainly on par with what the Allies could muster. And as a result, the United States' strategy, War Plan Orange, which is to reinforce the Bataan Peninsula at a date and time to be later specified, was put into action. Although, again, because of MacArthur's haphazard and lackluster focus and attention to the details of the war plan, the U.S. and Filipino Army retreats to the Bataan Peninsula, which looks like a thumb that juts out into Manila Harbor, or at least the entry to Manila Harbor, and finds themselves not having the adequate amount of food, ammunition, medicine, and other crucial supplies needed to hold out until relieved per the specifications of War Plan Orange. Now, MacArthur, he was in Manila at the Manila Hotel in his penthouse, and he decided to leave the city open. He didn't want it destroyed because of all the beautiful Spanish architecture. And he came across the Corregidor, which is a small tadpole-shaped island just south of Bataan. And that's where he made his headquarters, in the Malitna Tunnel. And there's plenty of famous photos that show him there hunkered down with his staff as Japanese aircraft and naval warships bombard the island. And in the north, on the Bataan Peninsula, the U.S. and Filipino army is forced to fight against an ensuing onslaught of Japanese as they begin to push their way south to ultimately capture the entirety of the peninsula, because they know once Bataan falls, Corregidor will fall swiftly thereafter, and then as a result, the Philippines will be pretty much secured. And of course, the Japanese know it's pretty much impossible to have garrison manpower on every single island within the Philippines. After all, the Philippines have in the neighborhood of 10,000 islands, and it's actually more likely 7 to 10,000 islands. But again, even if you were to put 100 men on each island, we'll say, that's 70,000 men that are caught up in garrison duties that can be utilized elsewhere. So they know that their main focus is capture Bataan, capture Corregidor, capture Manila, you capture the Philippines. And of course, the U.S. and Filipino forces on Bataan know this all too well. And among those who's leading the gallant resistance against the Japanese is Major General Jonathan Wainwright. Cavalry commander by this point, he had been promoted en route to the Philippines when he was assigned there, and he now oversaw the defense of the Bataan Peninsula. And to his credit, given what it was that he had at his disposal, he did a pretty solid job. However, War Plan Orange would never actually realistically be fulfilled. And that's because, given the devastation wrought against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, though fortunately the 3 aircraft carriers were out doing drills the day of Pearl Harbor, the fleet and thereby the Navy had absolutely no way to get to and resupply the Philippines. So the American and Filipino defenders on Bataan found themselves in a desperate struggle and almost a last man standing Alamo type situation. And the lives of MacArthur and Wainwright are chronicled in the book The Fate of the Generals by Jonathan Horn. And Horn is able to give this passage that documents what it was like when MacArthur was ordered to leave the Philippines by President Roosevelt. In his mind, Roosevelt didn't want the Japanese to win a massive PI victory by having in their possession, dead or alive, arguably the most famous American who was, at that point in time, living. So to avoid that from happening, he had ordered MacArthur to leave the Philippines. And of course, MacArthur was going on and on about, no, I'm going to stay and defend and fight to the death and die fighting alongside my men. A very noble idea, but certainly impractical, and certainly one that a 4-star general ought to know better than to make such bluster about. But again, this isn't any 4-star general that we're talking about. This is Douglas MacArthur, who, again, has found himself in this moment. And this moment occurs on March 10th, 1942, about 4 months into the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. And Horn describes it as the following, quote, across the channel, Wainwright could hear the sound of guns calling him back to Bataan. He walked back through the Malitna Tunnel with General Douglas MacArthur, who stopped to shake hands with Wainwright's aides and left them amazed that he recalled their names. Out of the other side of the tunnel, the 2 generals stood alone again. "Goodbye, Jonathan," MacArthur said as he handed Wainwright some cigars and shaving cream and shook his hand. "When I get back, if you're still on Bataan, I will make you a lieutenant general." The most vital point went undiscussed. Wainwright had not asked, and MacArthur had not offered, when he would return. Both knew that the answer would make all the difference to soldiers running out of food, and yet no difference at all to a duty that would carry on however long it took. "I'll be on Bataan, if I'm alive," Wainwright said as he stared into MacArthur's dark eyes one more time and then headed down to the boat. "Many times in the days and months and years that followed our last meeting on Corregidor," Wainwright would write, "I thought of my parting promise, a promise I could not keep." End quote. And then once MacArthur departed, the title of Commander-in-Chief in the Philippines, or Commander-in-Chief of U.S. forces in the Philippines, went to Wainwright. He now oversaw all U.S. and Filipino resistance against the Japanese, and control of Bataan was handed over to Major General Edward King. Yet, within a month of MacArthur departing, the situation on Bataan grew hopeless. And unless more troops and more supplies could be brought to Bataan, this is Wainwright at least insisting to Washington, then they would be starved into submission. And on April 9th, less than 1 month after MacArthur left, King surrendered. He had 72,000 men under his command. Granted, not all of them could be considered fit for combat, yet still it was a sizable number, and a number that the Japanese now had to contend with. And they were obviously dead set on capturing Bataan, capturing Corregidor. So for them, this additional 70 plus thousand group of men, women, even some Filipino civilians, women, children, was a burden to them. And the Japanese were never one to look kindly upon surrender. So to them, it was dishonorable what the Americans and Filipinos did by throwing down their arms and waving the white flag. So not only did they have to contend with the nuisance of dealing with them on a military logistics level, they then had the philosophical and psychological view of them being no more than cowards because they had surrendered. And Horn talks about that decision-making process that the Japanese faced, and ultimately the course of action that they decided upon to continue their advance south to Corregidor, while also ensuring that these newly minted prisoners would be dealt with in an orderly and proficient military manner. And Horn writes the following, quote, "General Mashahara Homa had needed to shepherd the American and Filipino forces off the peninsula as quickly as possible so he could make room for his own forces, the ones he would need to undertake operations against Corregidor. But instead of the 40 or even 50,000 American and Filipino soldiers he had expected to find on Bataan, he had found himself with about 80,000 starving prisoners in no condition to go anywhere on foot. How to transport them to prison at Camp O'Donnell, the former Philippine Army training camp not far from Tarlac on Luzon's central plain, had posed a problem that Homa had left to his subordinates. They had solved it through what would become known as the Bataan Death March. Up the east side of Bataan, the prisoners had come in jumbled columns, a few men abreast. The fighting had turned what was not a bad road before into a terrible one. Dust was everywhere, shelter from the sun seemingly nowhere. If the prisoners needed water, and they all desperately did, they would have to drink from roadside ditches filled with animal waste and the bloated bodies of men beaten for having made the mistake of asking to fill their canteens from the nearby wells or walking too close to the vehicles driving the opposite way, full of Japanese soldiers swinging poles and rifles. In many cases, the bodies in the ditches belonged to men who simply did not have the strength or will to carry on to the next 10 miles northward, and sometimes twice that far. The Japanese promised food ahead, but never had enough. Alongside the road gathered Philippine civilians, risking their lives to deliver food to family members and perfect strangers in the ranks of sunburned, blistered bodies. The Japanese rewarded the prisoners who made it 66 miles to the highway junction of San Fernando by stuffing them into train cars that would carry them most of the rest of the way to O'Donnell. Crammed in so tight as to give deadly meaning to the term standing room only, men with dysentery relieved themselves where they stood. Some breathed in the smell. Others could not breathe at all. Hundreds of American marchers and thousands of the Filipino ones, who had always made up the bulk of the army on Bataan, never reached O'Donnell. End quote. The Allies would become, as the war progressed, more and more familiar with the manner in which the Japanese fought. Fanatical, zealot-like, and using brutality and barbarism almost as policy. It was an accepted norm, not the outlier. And while this was not the first instance of barbarism against Western forces, this had already occurred in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Rangoon, and certainly had occurred half a decade prior against the Chinese on a genocidal scale. It was the first time that such an occurrence was actively being documented and was happening against the United States. And they would become quite familiar with how the Japanese fought war. And instances like the Bataan Death March would only grow in size, scale, and lethality to any Allied soldier, American, British, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, Canadian, who surrendered and found themselves in the hands of their Japanese captors. The Japanese believed in the Bushido Code, and a loosely translated into English phrase of Fumeo ni Shuri meant death before dishonor. So to them, anything other than death, especially if you are serving your country, is considered dishonorable to yourself, to your unit, to your nation, to the emperor, and arguably most importantly, to your family. So when the Japanese had these American and Filipinos in their captivity, they treated them with rank contempt and disregard, almost as if how a slaughterhouse would treat cows, pigs, and other animals, which, given the name of the business, were being solely utilized for their own ends, being killed and chopped up for food. That is how the Japanese viewed anyone who surrendered. And the horrific stories of the Bataan Death March would eventually find their way into the mainstream. But until that time, the only people who knew truly what it was like to be under the thumb of Japanese oppression were those who were active participants in it. Either the death march itself, being on the hell ships that would transport them to Japan, or other parts of the so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was just a euphemistic way to say the Japanese Imperial Empire, or in prisoner of war and captivity camps, which Jonathan Wainwright would find himself in following his surrender of Corregidor on May 6th, 1942. And when he surrendered, which by that point the Japanese had already systematically reduced any former remaining defenses that the Americans possessed on the island, and they had begun landing assault forces on Corregidor, there was little left for him to do, and there was no point in fighting to the end like MacArthur had wanted to do himself, and even Wainwright's decision would be certainly discreetly publicly, but openly in private, ridiculed by MacArthur, who believed that he would have never done that. What he did was disgraceful, and it would make for bitter tension down the road once the two of them reconnected. But Wainwright, who is the highest ranked American in Japanese captivity during the entirety of the war, surrendered Corregidor and thereby the rest of the Philippines to the Japanese, and was ushered from one prisoner of war camp to the next, ultimately finding himself on Formosa. And while he was there, Horn describes what it was like for Wainwright, whose experience, though slightly better than that of the enlisted personnel because of the fact that he was a high-ranking officer, was still one that was common practice or was almost unanimous among any Allied prisoners of war who fell into the hands of the Japanese that survived. And some would even argue that if you had survived and you lived through it, you were better off being dead because of how brutal it was. And Horn gives a description of just how brutal it was when he writes, quote, "To keep up appearances, the Japanese presented Wainwright with what he deemed a willy way around the Geneva Conventions. His fellow officers would have the opportunity to work on a prison farm. If they took it, their food would improve. If they refused, well, they would see. Japanese called the farm program volunteer. Wainwright called it coercion and refused. As it stood, the prisoners could not have accomplished much in the fields anyway. They managed 10 minutes of calisthenics in the morning, but had energy for little else. Their swollen ankles presaged the return of beriberi, the vitamin deficiency they had come to know on Bataan. Wainwright developed the dry kind, which resulted in less swelling but a slapping sound every time he took a step. He had lost the muscle control needed to stop his toes from swinging down like a mousetrap the moment his heel touched the ground. The wooden clogs, which were many sizes too small, added to the discomfort. Nevertheless, the camp rules required the Americans to stay on their feet. Except for a short siesta after lunch, the prisoners could not be in bed during the day." End quote. In the few weeks in which he found himself in this new prison setting, he'd lost 5 pounds. And prior to the war, Wainwright was not a very robust figure. He was lean, he was in shape, but he was not flabby, shall we say. And while he was in captivity, he certainly earned that nickname that has since been given to him, that of skinny, because of how much weight he lost and because of how swollen and sunken he looked once he came out of Japanese captivity. And again, as I had mentioned, that experience, the physical experience, is one that many Allied soldiers suffered throughout their time in captivity. And this brutal treatment by the Japanese, which Wainwright, in his own words, considered systematic starvation, was common. And unfortunately, that is what fueled the vitriolic hatred that arose between the two combatants in the Pacific. In Europe, there was certainly that tension of, well, we're fighting the enemy and either it's kill or be killed. But there was no underlying racial hatred and tension. If a group of Germans surrendered, short of them being the elite SS, by and large, the Allies would take them into captivity. If any Japanese tried to surrender, the Allied units would be very weary, very hesitant, because in the past they had experienced booby traps, fake surrenders when one man would surrender and then machine guns would open up on those coming to take him into captivity, and wounded Japanese crying out for help only to pull a grenade pin, explode it, and kill whatever soldier or Marine came over to assist them. So they were very weary. And it's experiences like Wainwright's that contributed to that tension that found itself omnipresent throughout the war in the Pacific. Eventually, slowly but surely, MacArthur was able, alongside Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was the commander in chief of the Pacific Fleet, to push the Japanese Empire of the Rising Sun closer and closer to the home islands themselves. And he had made the pledge that I shall return to anyone who was listening, but in particular to the Americans and Filipinos who he had led while fighting against the Japanese. And it was on October 20th, 1944, that MacArthur fulfilled that promise with as much pomp and circumstance that his ego would tolerate. And that was during the liberation of the Philippines and the landing on the island of Leyte. And Horn describes the scene as the following, quote, "Around 1 in the afternoon, MacArthur boarded a landing barge and took a seat near the stern. With him were 4 correspondents and a group of officers, including Lieutenant General Richard Sutherland, Lieutenant General George Kenny, the pilot, Colonel Weldon Dusty Rhodes, and Doctor, Colonel Roger Doc Edgeburg, who by this time had become the general's aide-de-camp and confidant. MacArthur had hoped to have seated beside him his old friend Manuel Cuzon, but the President of the Commonwealth had died in the United States in August. Instead, it would be Cuzon's old rival, Sergio Osmina, whom the landing barge picked up from a nearby ship. The old voice of freedom from Corregidor, Colonel Carlos Romalu, boarded too. "Carlos, my boy," MacArthur exclaimed, "here we are, home." For the rest of the voyage, the other passengers kept repeating the phrase, "Well, we were, here we are," as if they themselves could not believe it. "Son," MacArthur yelled to a sailor aboard a boat returning from the beaches, "where is the hardest fighting going on?" The sailor pointed ahead. "Head for that beach," MacArthur said. But the barge could not make it all the way. Less than 50 yards from the beach, it bottomed out. After the image of MacArthur wading the rest of the way ashore had become famous, rumors would spread that he had staged the entire scene. To the contrary, an aide had tried to avoid it by calling for a special boat to carry MacArthur and his party to dry land. The harried officer receiving the request had hundreds of vessels to worry about unloading. "Let him walk," he responded. Some of those around MacArthur perceived displeasure in his face as he sank his khakis into the knee-deep water filled with debris. But the cameramen, fast enough to capture him striding ashore in fewer than 40 footsteps, produced pictures that day that made him look as preserving and prophetic as his promise to return had made him sound. End quote. This was his day of liberation. His promise kept, that he indeed would return. And this would begin the long and arduous campaign, the longest that the United States Army would find itself in during the entirety of World War II, to liberate the Philippines. And it will go on well into August 1945, and even would result in a Japanese soldier in 1971 coming out of the jungle and surrendering, not realizing that the war had ended. He had been so caught up in the fighting and the combat and devotion to his unit, emperor, and nation that he went on acting as if the war had not ceased. But that really hammers the point home that the Japanese would fight on quite literally until death, or until told otherwise by a commanding officer. But that campaign would be brutal and it would be difficult, but ultimately it would end in U.S. victory. And when the final unconditional surrender was signed on board the USS Missouri, the battleship, the Mighty Mo, on September 2nd, 1945, which would become known as VJ Day, the war was finally over. And with the end of the war came a reunion between two former friends. MacArthur, who had been awarded the Medal of Honor for his earlier heroics escaping the Philippines, and Wainwright, who had been nominated for the Medal of Honor because of his defiance and his ability to lead the American and Filipino forces in such a desperate defense for almost 6 months, which War Plan Orange had originally allocated as time necessary for the Philippines to hold out. So he was able to do that and almost hit it right on the mark in terms of what was expected of him, even with all the deficiencies. But when the two finally met, Horn describes the scene as follows, quote, "A photographer captured the moment the two men embraced. MacArthur pulled his head back, not to escape, but as if to bring a face from the past back into focus. Wainwright, MacArthur wrote, was haggard and aged. His uniform hung in folds on his fleshless form. He walked with difficulty and with the help of his cane. His eyes were sunken, and there were pits in his cheeks. His hair was snow white, and his skin looked like old shoe leather. At first, neither man opened his mouth. Neither man knew what to say. In the 3.5 years since MacArthur and Wainwright had last seen each other, an age had gone by. A war that had begun with American soldiers sampling monkey and iguana on Bataan and ended with American generals ordering steaks in a Japanese hotel. A war that had begun with men on horseback and ended with men manufacturing an atomic bomb. It was hard to reconcile, and it was perhaps unfair to expect even a man as eloquent as MacArthur to find the words to do so. Well, I'm glad to see you, MacArthur said. The words still did not come to Wainwright. Reporters saw him swallow. I'm glad to see you too, he finally said. Both men had tears in their eyes. End quote. And again, as mentioned, because of Wainwright's defiance and defense, he had been nominated in 1942 for a Medal of Honor, and eventually he would be awarded such a high honor. But that nomination was nitpicked by MacArthur, and he talked about it behind his back and privately didn't believe that Wainwright earned it. But then on the flip side, while he was signing the surrender documents for Japan's capitulation, Wainwright was standing right behind him. And next to Wainwright was General Arthur Percival, who was the British general that surrendered in Singapore. And when he was finished, MacArthur handed Wainwright the pen. So it's that interesting dichotomy between the two individuals, that MacArthur, who would continue to feel his ego as the supreme commander in Japan and Korea before being relieved by President Truman, and Wainwright, who would win the Medal of Honor, but unfortunately would die less than a decade later, that those two men would have such differing paths in history, yet when it crossed, they could not find themselves sharing the spotlight, and primarily because of MacArthur and his ego. Nevertheless, it was an interesting insight to how those two individuals were part of this story, the liberation of the Philippines, and how both of them were extremely important figures in the history of World War II, and how they would then factor in to the popular histories that had followed since World War II. As mentioned earlier, the Philippine campaign would be the longest that the U.S. Army would fight in during all of World War II, and the Luzon campaign specifically, and Luzon being the main island in the Philippines, would be the longest that the U.S. Army would be in. I had previously mentioned that the Philippines was the longest, but because the Philippines had Leyte, Mindanao, Luzon, Corregidor, there were so many different islands and amphibious operations in the Philippines that the Americans undertook. It's unfair to say that the Philippines, in a very broad blanket statement, were the longest. Luzon was the longest that the U.S. Army was involved in throughout the entirety of World War II. And that began on January 9th, 1945, when the 6th Army of the United States, about 191,000 men, landed. First, the Japanese were taken by surprise, but then they developed stiff resistance. And this resistance would continue for another 8 months. And Nathan Prather writes about this in his book, The Luzon Campaign 1945, in which he talks exclusively from the infantryman's perspective what it was like to fight on Luzon during those final 8 months of World War II. And the first excerpt quoted is one that occurred only 3 days after the landings, in which the Japanese resistance really started to pick up. And Prather describes the following, quote, typical of the combat faced by the 43rd Infantry Division at this point was the action of Company G, 169th Infantry Regiment, on January 12, 1945. The battalion was attacking near Hill 318. The enemy defenders, estimated to be a company of infantry liberally supplied with machine guns, grenades, and blocks of TNT, held a position that could only be reached across a narrow ridge 70 yards long. At the end of the ridge sat an enemy pillbox and several rifle positions on rising ground. The initial attack cost the life of the 3rd Battalion, 196th Infantry Commander. Halted by enemy fire, Company G sought a way to attack this menacing position. Staff Sergeant Robert E. Laws, a squad commander from Altoona, Pennsylvania, went forward alone under vicious enemy fire until he was close enough to toss grenades at the pillbox. Return enemy fire wounded him, but he persisted in his one-man assault, using grenades passed forward to him by his squad mates. Finally, one of his grenades entered the pillbox and knocked it out. Determined to finish off the enemy defenders, Staff Sergeant Laws led the way forward again, knocking out successive enemy positions with grenades passed him by his buddies. He was hit again, in the arms and legs, and by enemy TNT blocks tossed in his path. 3 Japanese charged at him with fixed bayonets, but he cut 2 down with his automatic weapon, and then engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the 3rd. The 2 men fell to the ground and rolled some 60 feet down the steep ridge. When his men finally reached him, they found the enemy soldier dead, and Staff Sergeant Laws climbing back up the hill to get back into the fight despite new wounds to his head. He was treated and evacuated, surviving to receive his Medal of Honor. End quote. Now, by this point, when the U.S. Army had begun operations in the Philippines, it was a finely tuned killing machine. It was certainly much more adept at the job that it was called upon to do than it was in 1942. And as mentioned, the 43rd Infantry Division, they had first begun combat on New Guinea, and they had seen combat in the Northern Solomons, and this was, for all intents and purposes, their 3rd campaign. And this unit, a National Guard unit no less, comprised men of the states of Connecticut, Maine, Rhode Island, and Vermont. And they, the 43rd Infantry Division, was experienced and proficient in the ways of war, or at least fighting this war. And they were among the early units that had landed on the Philippines. And they themselves were tasked with fighting in the Zambales Mountains and the Shimbu line around Manila. Manila we'll come back to, and that'll be the subject exclusively of the 3rd book. But for the time being, it's worth noting that the 43rd was an experienced and combat-hardened infantry division. And indeed, most of the units that found themselves fighting in the Philippines were experienced combat units. And that would come in handy, especially during the planning stages of the ambitious assault on Corregidor. Corregidor being the last major American bastion that was still holding out after the fall of Bataan. And the U.S. and MacArthur in specific sought to recapture it it was sort of a combination of pride and vanity and also strategic necessity. Corregidor, given its position, though only, as I had mentioned earlier, tadpole shaped, was an important barrier of entry into Manila Harbor. So, in order to get into Manila Harbor safely, that had to be taken care of. And Corregidor had to be assaulted and captured. And the plan that was devised to capture Corregidor was extremely risky. And it was two-pronged. One was a parachute drop onto the island made by the 11th Airborne Division, who had previously seen combat on New Guinea, although had not to the extent that was being planned in this operation, who would secure strategic positions on Corregidor, and then a follow-up amphibious assault by the 24th Infantry Division. Those two units would be merged into Rock Force, and it was extremely risky. The island itself is only 2.2 square miles, and for a single C-47 Dakota transport aircraft, which would carry anywhere from 15 to 20 men, that would mean that the pilots could only pass over the island, drop 8 paratroopers at a time, and then swing around to continue that cycle until their plane was empty. Moreover, the parachute landing occurred at extremely low altitude. So that did not afford the paratroopers much in the way of allowing time between their chute opening and then hitting the ground. Thankfully, as risky as the planning for this operation was, the end result was not as bloody and brutal as it could have been. For the Japanese did not master the art of anti-aircraft or anti-paratrooper weapons that the Germans had, certainly by this point in the war, though it didn't really do them much good. Nevertheless, that assault by Rock Force is described by Pfeiffer as follows, quote, "With no place to go and no tent of surrendering, the Japanese fought on within Corregidor. One typical action was repeated numerous times while the island was cleared. Parrott First Class Lloyd G. McCarter from Washington State had landed on February 16th and immediately raced across 30 yards of exposed ground to knock out an enemy machine gun with hand grenades. 2 days later, he killed 6 enemy snipers while leading his platoon's advance. That night, a strong Japanese counterattack hit his company's position. He volunteered to move to an advanced, exposed position to get a better view of the attackers. Repeated attacks came against his position, only to be repelled. Finally, only PFC McCarter remained on his feet, unwounded, and still the Japanese attacked. Shouting encouragement to his wounded comrades around him and yelling defiance at the enemy, he continued to beat off attacks single-handed. He repeatedly crawled back to American lines for more ammunition between assaults. He burned out one automatic rifle and acquired another, burned this one out as well, and grabbed an M1 rifle. As dawn broke, the Japanese made one last desperate effort to overrun the Americans. Private First Class McCarter stood erect, blazing away at the enemy. He was soon seriously wounded, but refused to leave his position until he had directed others on the best avenue for the American counterattack. He received his Medal of Honor from President Harry S. Truman at the White House the following year." End quote. In this 10-day bloodbath, the 11th Airborne Division and the 24th Infantry Division, themselves fighting in their third campaign of the war, had successfully dislodged the Japanese from Corregidor, and now the road to Manila Bay lay open. So while there was an assault that occurred driving down the south of Luzon, centered on Manila, the U.S. also had forces that swung north and began the fight towards Baguio, which was considered the summer capital of the Philippines. And this fighting that occurred where a majority of the fighting on Luzon would occur for the remainder of campaign. And one of the units that was poised to strike into northern Luzon was the 25th Infantry Division, which had the nickname of Tropic Lightning. And that's because they had been among one of the first American Army units to be deployed into the Pacific Theater. They had fought on Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and now were fighting in the Philippines. And they, unlike the 43rd Infantry Division, which was a National Guard unit, were a regular line Army infantry division composed of regular soldiers, not weekend warriors, as the negative connotation of National Guardsmen classifies them as, though certainly they were warriors in their own right. And the fighting that the 25th Infantry found themselves in would be brutal and it would be vicious, especially since a majority of the Japanese defenders were themselves in central and northern Luzon. And Prather describes one such attack by the famous Wolfhounds Regiment of the 25th Infantry Division. Quote, 27th Infantry Wolfhounds Regiment occupied the Japanese defending Route 5 by attacking to secure the high ground along the road at Lumboy. As expected, the Japanese resisted fiercely. As Company B, 27th Infantry, attacked one strong Japanese group of defenders, Staff Sergeant Raymond H. Cooley, a platoon guide in the company, distinguished himself. Staff Sergeant Cooley, from Richard Clay, Tennessee, saw that his platoon was pinned down by two enemy machine guns, rifles, and mortars. On his own initiative, he advanced to within 20 yards of one machine gun and attacked it with a hand grenade. Before the missile could explode, however, the Japanese hurled it back. Arming a second grenade, Staff Sergeant Cooley held the grenade for several seconds before again tossing it into the enemy position. This explosion destroyed the enemy and crew. Moving forward again, Staff Sergeant Cooley repeated his actions at the second machine gun position. As he advanced, he tossed grenades into several enemy foxholes, knocking out the defending riflemen protecting the machine guns. In the act of tossing yet another grenade, he was attacked by 6 enemy soldiers. Knowing he could not dispose of the grenade safely without risking injury to his own men, Staff Sergeant Cooley dropped to the ground and covered the grenade with his own body. He was severely wounded as the grenade exploded, but none of his buddies were injured, and the attack succeeded in knocking out the enemy defenses. Staff Sergeant Cooley survived to receive his Medal of Honor. End quote. The 25th Infantry was certainly no novice to jungle warfare, and particularly when it came to fighting an enemy they knew so well. Yet, not every combat division that saw action on Luzon was a veteran unit. Indeed, one of them, the 33rd Infantry Division, was green, and this would be their first major combat campaign. And it's interesting that by this point in the war, early 1945, that this unit would find itself in its first major campaign. Moreover, they would find it against an even more ferocious and zealous, if that's even a word, opponent than in 1942, simply because of the fact that as the Japanese were pushed back closer to their home island, they fought more ferociously. So to be thrown into this meat grinder, this hell come to earth for the first time, certainly it is a daunting and, frankly, even scary proposition for anyone. And this is especially true when you're being fired at and shot upon in anger. And Prather talks about how in April of 1945, 4 months after the initial landings, fighting on Luzon was continuing to such an extent that it required deploying this green unit to fight against the Japanese in northern Luzon. And he talks about how this unit suffered a very similar fate to its sister unit, certainly sister unit in designation and not legitimate sister unit, because while the 33rd itself is also a Army National Guard unit from Illinois, its sister unit in this comparison, the 32nd Infantry Division, was among the first deployed in the Pacific, had fought with MacArthur since New Guinea, and in its first major combat operation, fought without artillery and utilized frontal assaults. And that is exactly what Pfeiffer describes when he writes, quote, "It was during Company C's attack on Hill X that Private First Class Dexter I. Kurtstetter distinguished himself. The soldier from Centralia, Washington, was with the lead squad as it moved under heavy Japanese fire along the Razorback Ridge. Enemy machine guns, rifles, mortars, and artillery fire opposed the advance. Sheltered by spider holes, tunnels, caves, and being well camouflaged, the Japanese had the upper hand. When the 5 men ahead of him were wounded, Private First Class Kurtstetter moved to the front of the assault team, leading his squad. Spotting an enemy cave, he dropped from the trail along a cliff using precious footholds and wiped out 4 enemy soldiers sheltering in the cave. Climbing back to the trail, he attacked a machine gun protected by riflemen and mortar fire. After knocking out the gun with his rifle and grenades, he used up all his remaining ammunition, repelling an attack by 20 enemy soldiers, forcing them to scatter. He returned his squad for more ammunition and first aid for his left hand, which had blistered from the heat of his rifle. With fresh ammunition, he guided a new platoon to a position from which a new attack could be launched, killing 3 enemy troops on the way forward. Due largely to his actions, Hill X was taken that day and held for the next 3 days despite ferocious Japanese counterattacks. For his leadership on April 11, 1945, Private First Class Dexter J. Kurtstetter received a Medal of Honor. Nor was it a one-man show on Hill X. Following Private First Class Kurtstetter up the hill was Private First Class Joseph Pappas, Jr., who attacked a pair of enemy machine guns despite the fact that they concentrated their fire on him, as did the supporting riflemen. Enemy grenades shrouded him in smoke and dust as he made his way up the hill and knocked out both guns with grenades and bullets. Indeed, Company C, which the division's 33rd Infantry Division own history claims was one of the finest units in the division, stormed Hill X and blasted every enemy gun position and drove off any surviving enemy soldiers. Company C, those who survived, were left standing in a haze of smoke and acrid smells amid dozens of enemy dead, but they had seized the hill. It also earned itself a rare award for so small a unit, a Distinguished Unit Citation. End quote. No artillery, no air support, especially given the fact that they were in such tough terrain and environment, jungle canopies, razorback ridge lines, high mountains, and utilizing frontal assault. It's incredible that this green unit could pull off what they did, and they did so extremely successfully. Though the primary units that fought in the liberation of the Philippines and Luzon in specific were Army infantry divisions, they were assisted by guerrillas who had remained on Luzon since 1942, and they made up the United States Armed Forces in the Philippines Northern Luzon Division, Combat Operation Arm, Theater Command, whatever it is that you want to describe it. And they had been there fighting and were essential to winning on Luzon because some of them acted as aides or guides and knew the terrain certainly better than these Army infantrymen did, who had come ashore only 6 months earlier. And Pfeiffer talks about the dichotomy between the guerrillas and the regular Army units and how they were both able to intermingle and successfully utilize each other's skill set to win the fight against the Japanese. And he writes, quote, "The fighting continued. The Americans and USAF IPNL forces struggled in some of the worst country and worst weather conditions to find and attack the Japanese. The Japanese, in turn, fought to hold their positions to keep the Allies away from their few remaining supplies. Once again, these were small unit fights. such as the one on July 29th, 1945, deep in the Cordillera Mountains. Company D, 20th Infantry Regiment, 6th Infantry Division, was supporting a guerrilla attack against a Japanese stronghold. Two of the Filipino companies were pinned down by the Japanese fire. Corporal Melvin Mayfield saw the problem and rushed from shell hole to shell hole until he reached 4 enemy caves from which the fire was coming. From the top of the barren hill, he tossed grenades and fired his M1 carbine, assaulting each cave in turn while constantly under enemy fire. As he finished off the last cave, an enemy machine gun shattered his carbine and wounded him in his left hand. Disregarding the wound, he secured more hand grenades and again charged into the teeth of the enemy fire. This time, his target was an enemy observation post, which was directing fire on the trapped guerrillas. His gallant actions so inspired the guerrilla companies that they followed him up the hill and overran the entire enemy defense complex. For his leadership and personal gallantry on July 29, 1945, Corporal Melvin Mayfield received the Medal of Honor. The Ohio Natives Award was the last ground combat chronological action for which this award was given in World War II. End quote. Think about that. 17 days later, the war was over. Japan threw in the towel. Granted, it took 2 atomic bombs, but the fact that fighting was still occurring on the ground in Luzon at this time speaks volumes. And it really highlights the fact of just how brutal and intense the Japanese were in resisting American encroachments and advancements against what was considered rightfully theirs, an empire in the Pacific. And by the time the fighting on Luzon concluded, 10,380 Americans were killed, and there were 93,400 other battlefield casualties and non-related battlefield casualties. This was the highest casualty rate for any campaign in World War II that the United States Army found itself in. As I had mentioned earlier, the Battle of Manila was part and parcel, and in a way, a microcosm of what fighting was like in the Pacific, though it was an outlier in the sense that it was the only major urban combat battle in all of the Pacific theater. When you think of the Pacific, you think, and rightfully so, island hopping, jungles, forests, mountains, razorback ridges, or submarine warfare, carrier dogfights, naval battles. Very rarely do you think of urban combat. And that's because the fighting seldom occurred in cities. As MacArthur had done in 1941, leaving the city open to not be destroyed by the Japanese, so too did General Toyoki Yamashita, the revered Tiger of Malaya. He wanted to leave Manila open, and he initially ordered to withdraw all Japanese troops so that they could find themselves in northern Luzon fighting protracted guerrilla campaigns, or in southern Luzon, where they could then go from island to island, basically trying to outrun their American adversaries. Yet the man tasked with defending Manila was not only bullheaded enough to want to die there, but he was also an admiral. And where Yamashita was an army commander, the two had a fierce inter-service disconnect, and this existed 10 years prior and came to a head during World War II. The Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy did not get along, did not like each other, and thereby had a tough time having any sort of inter-service cooperation. And this climaxed in the Philippines here at Manila. The Rear Admiral, Sanjay Irabachi, had previously been on a Japanese destroyer, cruiser, corvette, frigate that was sunk, but he did not go down with the ship. As a result, he was made to view himself dishonorably. And because of that, he wanted to go out in a blaze of glory. He wanted to avenge his honor, and he wanted ultimately to die fighting for the emperor. Again, death before dishonor. So as a result, he and his Manila Naval Defense Force, about 16,000 Japanese sailors, Marines, and Army soldiers, dug in and created a honeycomb of defenses, much like they would on islands such as Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, but in an urban setting. And in the Battle of Manila, by Richard Connaughton, John Pimlott, and Duncan Anderson, the authors describe the meticulous and beautifully orchestrated Japanese defensive scheme for the Philippine capital. And they write, quote, "The Japanese were adept at improvisation, exploiting all the opportunities presented by a city area. Street barricades were constructed quickly and effectively, using anything from overturned vehicles to steel rails embedded in the ground or in concrete drums. Anti-tank and anti-personnel mines were deployed to protect the approaches to barricades and were sown, often indiscriminately, to impede movement over bridges, along roads, or across open ground. In addition, naval depth charges taken out of store or recovered from vessels in Manila Bay were concealed at key locations and electrically detonated as soon as American troops arrived. While chromatic mines, designed to avoid the normal methods of magnetic detection, were used as booby traps, occasionally on top of or around more conventional explosives. There was even cases of aerial bombs recovered from crashed or disabled aircraft being buried with a nose-impacted fuse set close to the surface, requiring less than 50 pounds of pressure to set it off. The botanical gardens, for example, were described by the Americans as, quote, one vast minefield consisting of every type of obstacle from grenade booby traps to huge aerial bombs, end quote. In nearly all cases, barricades and minefields were covered by machine gun or rifle fire from protected positions. Many such positions were pillboxes constructed from concrete, metal, wood, and earth, depending on what was available and how long the defenders had to prepare. These were designed to absorb infantry fire and were normally protected by barbed wire as well as mines. Although buildings in the city often prevented the integration of pillbox defenses, pillboxes were not always within sight of others around them and could not, therefore, provide supporting fire. Some were connected by tunnel and trenches, allowing the defenders to move around, even under enemy attack. In more open areas, pillboxes were buried and camouflaged. In the Loma Cemetery, for example, three 25mm automatic cannons were dug in and disguised as burial mounds, quote, complete with sod, flowers, and statues or crosses, end quote. As the battle raged, many pillboxes gained additional protection from the rubble of buildings destroyed by American artillery fire or deliberately demolished by the Japanese themselves. As might be expected, bridges across the Pasig River and other waterways in or around Manila were blown up, further impeding any American advance. End quote. Now, the Battle of Manila would be a titanic struggle between the U.S. Army and the Japanese. And as mentioned, it would be the first and really only major urban combat battle in the Pacific. And there was even a race to get to Manila between the American commanders. MacArthur had purposefully set the two commanders and pitted them against each other, General Oscar Griswold and General Robert Blighter. And what's interesting about Blighter is he is one of the few military commanders in all of World War II to have remained with the unit he initially had at the beginning of the war, as he did at the end. And his unit was the 37th Infantry Division, which was an Ohio National Guard unit nicknamed the Buckeye Division. And they had previously seen combat in northern Solomons. Now, they were deployed and had attempted to compete against the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division, which itself had been in combat in New Guinea and other areas in the Solomons, and were now finding themselves, again, racing to get to Manila. And MacArthur was sort of playing them against each other. Again, his ego certainly at play there. And they were assisted by the 11th Airborne Division, rock force following their successful assault on Corregidor as they advanced up from the south. So from the north came the 37th Infantry Division, the 1st Cavalry Division, and from the south, the 11th Airborne Division. As is the case with any urban combat battle, there is always the concern of the civilians and what exactly they, if any part they have to play, are forced to go through. And the Japanese were not necessarily known to be the most considerate of masters, even though they pledged Asia for Asians and wanted to rid it of white imperial, Western colonial, and imperialism. They were just as bad, if not more brutal. And there was a saying that the Filipinos would much rather have 300 years of Spanish rule than 5 of Japanese, because of just how brutal and awful the Japanese were. And the authors talk about what some of those actions that the Japanese committed in Manila, not only against American combat troops, which obviously makes sense, that's your main adversary if you are indeed considering yourself to be a cohesive fighting force, but also against the Philippine civilians and the city architecture as a whole. And they write, quote, squads of Japanese rampaged through the residential areas, picking up particular attention institutions and houses swollen with refugees. Either they entered the buildings, shooting and bayoneting those inside, or they set fire to the buildings and shot those attempting to escape. They wantonly destroyed many civic buildings, seemed to derive pleasure from attacking civilians in air raid shelters with hand grenades. Massacres continued throughout the city, often in schools, hospitals, and convents, among which was San Juan de Dios Hospital, Santa Rosa College, Lloyd's Church, Manila Cathedral, Paco Church, St. Paul's Convent, and St. Vincent de Paul Church on Marcelino Street. A witness recalled how, quote, violence spread throughout the city. Several hundred innocents were beheaded, bayoneted, or shot only because they angered or displeased the Japanese. On one street in Pasay, all the inhabitants, including the women and children, were murdered. The men were wired together, drenched with gasoline, and set afire with grenades. End quote. By February 9th, the American shelling of Manila had begun to set houses on fire in a number of districts. One such was the Pimlott district. During the afternoon and evening, Japanese patrols combed the district, telling the people in the private houses and businesses that it was no longer safe for them to remain where they were. The Japanese recommended that they should come with them to an assembly point area at the Plaza Ferguson, so that they might then be moved into a safe area. So plausible was the Japanese proposal that most people went along willingly. 2,000 men, women, and children of all nationalities had assembled in the plaza by 5 p.m. A Japanese officer then appeared to set in train one of the foulest of organized incidents in modern warfare. First, he separated the men and the teenage boys from the women and children and ordered them to be taken to the Manila Hotel. Then the females, aged 15 to 22, were further separated from the older women and children. Of these, approximately 25 were taken to the Coffee Pot Cafe to the rear of the Bayview Hotel. Later, similar groups, mostly of Filipino extraction, were taken to the Miramar Apartments, Boulevard Apartments, and Alhambra Apartments. What the Japanese had done was to establish yoho houses, or brothels, close to the common areas so that Japanese Marines coming off duty might gratify themselves and satisfy their fantasies before dying in battle. End quote. This Japanese bloodlust was nothing more than a repetition of atrocities in China, specifically the Nanking brutality and rape that occurred in the city of Nanking. And of the population, 1 million were caught in the middle of this orgy of violence. And they had no stake other than just to have the fighting be over and allow them to live and go back to their normal lives to the best of their ability. But as a result of just Japanese wanton barbarism and brutality, they were not spared. Their bloodlust knew no end. And in this month-long battle, which had begun 7 days before this particular incident, more atrocities and more horror was to come. And one of the most brutal was taken against the Catholic population in Manila, which had again had centuries and centuries, or a long established tradition in the Philippines, and they were a particular target of Japanese rage and ruthlessness. And the authors describe the following terror campaign as, quote, of all the massacres, few were more notorious than that conducted at LaSalle College, end quote. They continue with, quote, the first episode in the unfolding atrocity was the appearance on Wednesday, February 7th, 1945, of a group of Japanese military accompanied by a well-dressed Filipino, presumably a Macapila, a Filipino collaborator, who appeared to be giving directions. Brother Xavier, who was the director of LaSalle College, and Judge Carlos were called for and taken away to the adjacent Japanese club, subsequently burnt down. Neither Brother Xavier nor the judge was ever seen again. Those remaining were ordered by the Japanese not to leave the building, even to go into the garden, nor to look out the windows. On Monday, February 12th, the occupants of LaSalle's southern wing had taken lunch, and most had gathered at the foot of the staircase for protection from shelling. So intense had this been that Mass had not celebrated that morning because Father Francis Cosgrave would not risk gathering so many people in one spot. A Japanese officer accompanied by 20 soldiers entered the college and took away 3 servants and 2 priests, supposedly for interrogation. It is believed that the Japanese suspected LaSalle had been used as a refugee for snipers. When they were returned, those who had been taken away showed signs of the most intense form of torture. One of the brothers carried his intestines in his hand. Those who witnessed the spectacle were gripped by fear. Then the Japanese officer barked an order. Fernando Vasquez Prada records, quote, Brother Leo, who knew how to speak Japanese, realized that the order was kill everyone. Brother Leo knew that the order was to be carried out. He shouted, please kneel and say the acts of contrition. Father Cosgrave, give us absolution. As the prayers commenced and as Father Cosgrave raised his hand to administer absolution, the shooting and bayoneting started. 58 people died that moment. End quote. Father Cosgrave takes up the story as, quote, some of the brothers managed to escape the scares. They pushed by the soldiers, some being bayoneted at the entrance to the chapel, others within the chapel itself. If anyone resisted, the officer would fire at them with his pistol or cut at them with his sword. As a result, several, in addition to bayonet wounds, were otherwise badly wounded. Some of the civilians were only 2 or 3 years old. A few were even younger. These were given the same treatment as their elders. When the Japanese had finished bayoneting us, they pulled and dragged the bodies and threw them in a heap at the foot of the stairs, the dead being thrown upon the living. Not many were killed outright by the bayoneting. A few died within 1 or 2 hours. The rest slowly bled to death. Among the brothers killed, 12 were German nationals. End quote. The authors continue, quote, unable at first to comprehend what was happening around him was 5-year-old Fernando Vasquez Prada. The explicit details of that event were left indelibly printed on his mind. Not until 1994 did he discuss the subject in public because, quote, I've always avoided going into the part of my life simply because the mere thought of what happened opens up wounds that took so many years to heal, wounds that are so fragile that it took my Catholic upbringing to forgive. To forget is not required of a Christian. I cannot and I will not forget the atrocities committed to my family during the Japanese occupation. End quote. What Manila was witnessing in February 1945 was a system extensively rehearsed in China. Senko Suzuko, a 3-part pentagram of kill all, burn all, destroy all. End quote. I think that pentagram of kill all, burn all, destroy all could easily be applied to Japan's mindset in executing the war in the Pacific. And it was applied, obviously, not just in the Philippines, but elsewhere. And had there been an invasion of Japan, it certainly would have been on display in a much more brutal fashion. And it's interesting that because Japan had many cities, that this would be a test run for what it would be like to fight in an urban combat situation against the Japanese. Aside from the many massacres that were occurring throughout the city, and indeed for every American killed, there would be 100 Filipino civilians that died, the Japanese were resisting just as fiercely against any American advance that was occurring. And one of the big ones was against Provisor Island, which was a island on the Pasig River that operated as the main infrastructure or electrical hub grid, if you were, for the entirety of the city. It was almost like a steel battleship in the way it was constructed and utilized by the Japanese in the defense of the island. And the authors describe the fighting that occurred there, which in itself is a microcosm of the fighting that occurred between the Americans and the Japanese in Manila, as the following. Quote, on February 10th, military attention turned to Provisor Island, described as follows by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Ross Smith. 5 large buildings and many smaller shed-like structures covered almost every foot of the island's surface. End quote. Most significantly, since it was an island, mutual support could be provided by those Japanese forces to the west, south, and southwest. The next attempt to secure the bridge began at 2:30 a.m. When covered by artillery fire, 90 U.S. infantrymen and 6 boats moved across the Estero de Tonquín. The moon had been hidden by clouds, but just as the first boats reached the island, it came out, bathing the sea in light. Japanese mortars and machine guns sank 3 of the boats and set afire a small fuel tank, the flames further illuminating the scene. The Americans were effectively tied down behind a large pile of coal until 5 a.m., when the fire went out and the moon was once again hidden by clouds. Taking that as their cue, they dashed into the municipal light and power building. Quote, a macabre game of hide-and-seek went on around the machinery inside until dawn, by which time Company E had gained possession of the eastern half of the building. The Japanese still held the western half. End quote. Eventually, the Japanese inside the building were overwhelmed. Now the Americans found themselves trapped inside their prize, unable to venture out because of effective Japanese fire. While they held on to what they had won, the division's artillery and mortars, supplemented by fire from tanks and tank destroyers, blasted the western half of the island in preparation for a further attack on the morning of the 11th. Until now, the American artillery fire had been confined to observed fire upon recognized targets. Now, this is quoted from the after-action report of the 37th Infantry Division. Quote, every effort had been made to spare the civilian population known to be held in captivity somewhere in the area, but as the tactical need for heavy firepower increased, permission was sought and obtained to place area artillery fire in front of our advancing lines without regard to pinpointed targets. Literal destruction of a building in advance of the area of friendly troops became essential, and the division had yet to determine upon a method of reducing the public buildings near Intramuros, the walled city citadel part of Manila, which were known to be veritable fortifications, so heavy was their construction and earthquake subjected Manila. End quote. The Americans had discovered that 4.2-inch mortars could not penetrate reinforced concrete. That could only be achieved by massed artillery fire, which had the collateral benefit of reducing casualties and costly hand-to-hand fighting. The attack on Provisor Island cost the 129th Infantry Regiment 35 killed, 240 wounded, and 10 missing. They had had no battle casualty replacements since January 9th. The 148th Infantry Regiment had only 5. End quote. So again, this unit of men from Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati who had fought in New Georgia, Bougainville, and now in the Philippines were familiar with cities, but they were not at all familiar with urban combat. And as was mentioned, the Americans had at first been tempered in their resolve to use heavy firepower, which they had done throughout the war in the European and Pacific theaters. heavy artillery, heavy mortars, airstrikes, naval gunfire, blowtorch, and corkscrew. The only reason why it was prolonged as long as it was to not happen or to not be implemented was because of the symbolic significance that Manila held, especially since it was formerly a U.S. territory, protectorate, however you want to describe it. Eventually, however, as the Americans advanced closer and closer towards Intramuros, which was the citadel of Manila, MacArthur had no choice but to allow for the use of airstrikes and even heavy artillery fire from 155 millimeter long tom guns, as they were called. And some were even fired point blank. So you'd have a gun, normally that's at a trajectory of, say, 45 degrees, that would be angled to fire straight, almost like when you see those images of old artillery from the Civil War with the wooden wheels. It would look like that, but it would be fired directly into buildings and Japanese positions. And what that was like, as the Americans employed such heavy firepower, is described by the authors in this way, quote, by February 15th, every infantry assault was being presaged by heavy weights of artillery fire, often delivered at very close range. The Americans soon discovered that the 105 millimeter howitzer, normally used for infantry support fire, was not particularly effective against well-constructed buildings, but that the 155 millimeter was far more useful. As a result, the 155s were brought to within 200 to 400 yards of the target, which would then be pounded with unfused shells to open cracks in the structure, followed by delayed fused ammunition to create a breach for the infantry to exploit. If the building was to be stormed, the bombardment was to be directed at the top floor first, the aim being to drive the defenders down into the path of the assaulting infantry. If it was just to be destroyed, the fire would concentrate on the bottom floor to collapse the structure. In extreme cases, such as the assault on Intramuros on February 28th, 8-inch and 240 millimeter howitzers could be brought into play, lobbing 240 or 360-pound shells into enemy positions from ranges as close as 800 yards. The results were devastating, particularly when it is borne in mind that the artillery is often joined by tanks, tank destroyers, and self-propelled M7s, 105 millimeter howitzers mounted on tank bodies. During the attack on the Manila Police Headquarters on February 13th to 20th, for example, more than 680 rounds of 155 millimeter ammunition were fired in support of the infantry assaults, while the 10-day battle for the Philippine General Hospital and University Campus Complex, beginning on the 14th, involved a staggering total of 3,400 rounds of 105 millimeter and 155 millimeter fire. On February 22nd, during the assault on the City Hall, two 155 millimeter howitzers of the 136th Field Artillery Battalion were brought to within 250 yards of the target, the east wall of which was hit by 145 rounds before the infantry went in. The attack on Intramuros has been described in an earlier chapter, but it is worth noting that between 0730 and 0830 hours on February 28th, a total of 7,896 rounds, 185 tons of HE, high explosive, AP, armored piercing, and white phosphorus, WP shells were fired by a mixture of artillery, tanks, tank destroyers, plus a further 1,900 rounds, 45 tons of HE and WP fired by 4.2-inch mortars, all into an area of little more than 3 square kilometers. It was inevitable that civilians would be hit. In their overwhelming desire to minimize infantry casualties, the Americans lost sight of the need to protect the Filipino population. End quote. It is often inevitable that you would have casualties among the civilian population. And indeed, urban combat is one of the most unpredictable of terrains to wage a battle in. And there's no real way to calculate just how many people are killed and certainly how many people were killed by friendly fire. It's obvious that a majority of the Filipinos killed were by the Japanese in their Manila massacre frenzy, but the 250,000 civilian casualties more than half of which were killed, or at least a fair half anyway. The majority of that was from the Japanese barbarism. Of the Manila Naval Defense Force, 16,000 were killed, virtually no survivors. On the American side, there were 1,010 killed and another 5,565 wounded. The American reliance on air power and artillery promoted this notion of destroying the city in order to save it, and the wreckage wrought throughout Manila was brutal. In one particularly ironic case, MacArthur's penthouse and his library of his and his father's collection of books was set ablaze, whether or not it was by an accidental misfire by the Americans or the Japanese sabotage. His legacy, his history, his heritage, his home was part of the collateral damage that was factored into the American usage of artillery and air power in conducting this urban combat battle. And the Battle of Manila was a warning to American commanders of what was to come if indeed the U.S. decided to invade Japan and conduct fighting on the home island itself. Thankfully, it never came to that. And within a year, the Philippines gained its independence. To tie it all back, it is worth mentioning that if this new breed of American, I guess imperialism, if you want to call it, takes full effect, it is the hope of a nation that it does not lead to similar outcomes to that of Manila and Luzon. For no one should ought to be subjected to such brutality, barbarism, and violence. Again, if the aims are simply to conquer territory for one's own self-interest, either in the case of the Americans or the Japanese. And let's maybe have the Philippines stand as a warning to what happens when you have empires that clash against each other, or when empires expand or contract and are forced to react in those circumstances.